Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm pleased to welcome you back to our Voter Education Project series. We're holding webinars events meant to educate the American voter on crucial national security issues every week, right up to the election. So please be sure to check out our full schedule and register at securefreedom.org. Today's program is entitled Military Readiness in the Face of Global Threats, featuring our guests, Admiral James Winnefeld and Lieutenant General Thomas Spohr, and moderated by my center colleague, John Rossomando. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as our website, securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to the Center's Senior Analyst for Defense Policy, John Rossomando.
Thank you, Adam. I'd just like to welcome our distinguished guests. Admiral James Winnefeld served as Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2011 to 2015. The Admiral was the commander of the USS Enterprise on 9/11, and among other things, was a consultant for the 1986 movie Top Gun. Also joining us is Lieutenant General Thomas Spohr, who was the Deputy Commander of U.S. forces in Iraq and was Director of the U.S. Army of Business Transformation, where he oversaw a streamlining of the U.S. military, U.S. Army in the past decade. We're going to be discussing some of the changes and some of the challenges facing the U.S. military amid declining budgets, and also rise of great power struggles with China and Russia, along with some of their allies such as Iran and North Korea. Recently, we've been seeing an increase in Chinese threats toward Taiwan, which the U.S. Is having to confront. The recent U.S. DoD memo on Chinese military force indicates that China plans on doubling its nuclear weapons stockpile from between 200 and 300 nuclear warheads to somewhere around 600. Some Chinese sources say that they want to move that up with 1,000. Other issues the United States military is looking into is increased autonomy, robot, unmanned warships, and units. We're also looking at increased artificial intelligence and moving into the 21st century. I'd like to start out by inviting Admiral Winnefeld to share some of his thoughts on some of the great issues that are facing our military, and where do you see things going with China. Then we'll follow up with comments from General Tom Spohr, and then we'll just go into a little bit of dialogue between the three of us.
Thank you, John, and give me a thumbs down if you can't hear me. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Appreciate you putting this forum together, and Tom, it's great to have an opportunity to chat with you over the course of the hour. It's quite an ambitious layout, John, for what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I'm going to do is point out for this group that I am agnostic politically. You're not going to find my name on any lists for either candidate. I try to stay in the middle and an equal opportunity critic and cheerleader for both sides when I think they get it right. So I think for my part of the contribution for this, I want to lay the groundwork for how I sort of think about these problems and how I've always thought about them. And principally, I always come at it from the notion of strategy being the very difficult effort of keeping a balance among ends, ways, means, and the prevailing security environment. And when that balance falls out of equilibrium, the risk goes up strategically for the United States or whichever country we're talking about. And so, when one of those variables in that balance changes, the others have to adjust. So today, when I think many of us would agree that the security environment in which we operate seems to be deteriorating in certain ways, though arguably not in others, you have to decide if that variable is out of balance, whether you're going to trim your ends, or you're going to increase your means, or you're going to become more clever in your ways, or some combination of the three. As far as the means go, I don't know that I would describe it as declining defense budget. I think there seems to be a consensus, even among moderate Democrats, that the defense budget's not going to decline, but it's not going to go up much at all in the coming years for obvious reasons, namely soaring debt made worse by the coronavirus, along with other hungry budget items like infrastructure and healthcare and the like. But all it takes is a few moderate Democrats and Republicans to maintain at least a flat line. And the day I was confirmed for the job as a vice chairman was the day the Budget Control Act was enacted by Congress. So I know what that's all about. We lived through quite a few years, as you know, of pretty flat budgets. And Bernard Brody once wisely said that strategy comes with a dollar sign. And so if our security environment is deteriorating, particularly vis-a-vis our peer competitors, and our means are going to stay flat, then that means we have to adjust somehow with ends and ways, or some combination of the two. So as far as ends go, the way I look at that problem, it's very difficult politically and institutionally to trim your ends, even though it really is necessary sometimes. So the way I try to look at it is through the lens of 5 prioritized, abstract, and enduring national security interests, which are the survival of the nation, number 1, the prevention of catastrophic attacks on the nation, such as a major cyber attack on our infrastructure, or a one-off terrorist attack like 9/11, or one nuclear weapon going off in Seattle. That would be number 2, prevention of catastrophic attacks. The third would be protection of the global operating system, which is mostly about flow security, both virtual and physical. The fourth is secure, confident, and reliable allies and partners. And then the fifth, still important, is protection of universal values. Each of those interests is threatened to some degree or another, and it's a great lens to look through the threats to our country. And we have to understand that we can't afford to protect all of them all of the time, but we should protect some of them all of the time. So that method provides a really useful way for me on providing advice on when to use force, and we can get into that in the questions if you'd like, and also to use that device as how to help us align our resources, because you want to take care of the most important things first. That does tend to scare the services, and I really experienced this as the vice chairman, because when you start to look at our budget, you quickly discover that most of the things that we love as services are oriented towards the 4th level interest, which is protecting our partners. Ends are something that we can be very thoughtful about if we use that prioritized list of security interests. As far as ways go, which is what I am most interested in, frankly, I would suggest that we are asymptotically approaching bankruptcy in our ways, meaning that the strategic military concepts we are talking about using, particularly against our peer competitors, are really starting to run out of steam. We can throw more money after that, give me more stuff, give me better stuff, but eventually our adversaries, who've been working very hard over the last 20 years while we've been doing counterinsurgency operations, it's just not going to work anymore. Now, part of that is driven by this vicious cycle between the COCOMs, the service chiefs, and Congress. When a COCOM is asked, can you execute your plan against China or Russia? The answer is never, it's in the green, I'm good to go. It's always some form of red or yellow, because they're always worried about losing forces. They'll always ask for more and better, which is music to the ears of the services and the service communities, and of course the senior members of Congress who stand to benefit from that. It's only rare that a secretary will go back to the COCOM and say, find me a better way. And worse, we tend to view our approach to these conflicts as though we're already in them, as though Saddam Hussein allowed us, 6 months to put all of our forces in place, and now we are in the Battle of Britain over the Taiwan Strait. And that's kind of the way we visualize these things, but that never happens. The enemy has a vote, especially when it won't be the United States or our allies who are starting this fight. China will never start a war on our own terms. They're going to do it on their terms, and it will happen very quickly. all of our wonderful stuff won't get there in time. You have to have your stuff there on day 0 of the fight. And I would submit that for both the Russia fight and the China fight, there are ways of looking at these problems differently, such as for China through the lens of what they really fear the most, which is less and less the US military and more the ability to control their own population. And an entirely new strategic concept for China would address that weakness, which is significant and also has significant implications for the size and shape and readiness of our military. So I will pause there. There's plenty to talk about here, John, with the great agenda you've put together, but I'm interested in hearing Tom's thoughts and then getting into a good discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. And John, I appreciate being invited to be on this webinar, and I want to align myself with Admiral Winnefeld's views. I thought they were cogent and very clear, and agree with them. I'm going to take a more journeyman approach, I think, to national defense than going at it from strategy, which is good because we don't want to repeat each other. But I thought it was interesting that thus far in the presidential campaign that is going on, national defense, national security has really, other than COVID, which is obviously a national security threat, national defense has not been an issue. And if you poll Americans, and Gallup does this, and they ask them, where do you rank national security in terms of interests that matter to you? And you ask, it doesn't even really clear the top 20, which is, you could take that as a sign of confidence that Americans trust their government, trust their military to protect them, or you could take it as a sense of complacency that we haven't had to worry about our security, and why should we worry about it now? I'm kind of in the middle on that. I worry that we have become a bit complacent about our security. Both of the presidential candidates expressed support for national defense. President Trump talks about the military that he has rebuilt. Former Vice President Biden has talked that he does not anticipate major defense cuts. And I think that'll probably take place, or at least hold up for the first 24 months of whatever administration comes in. It is hard to reduce the defense budget quickly. You can do it, as the Admiral found out when we had sequestration. A lot of the services were forced to cut their force size, and you can get savings over time. They're very difficult to get savings in the near term. I am encouraged by the defeat of, there was a proposal back in July to cut the U.S. defense budget by 10%. And this was championed by the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and it went down in flames, the defeat. In the House, it went down 324 to 93, with a bunch of Democrats joining the Republicans. And in the Senate, it went down 77 to 23. And so I think, even though you hear a lot about people wanting to cut defense, when it came to voting, at least in this past July, cutting defense even 10% did not get any support. Now, I think the folks that advocate for cutting the U.S. national defense have the biggest and the loudest megaphone, and those that are, continue to favor maintaining a strong military really are, if you will, the silent majority, that they don't feel like they need to talk or ought to talk that much. But I do think that support remains there. Having said all that, there is some controversy in the 2021 budget and authorization cycle. Nuclear testing came up. A lot of opposition to any money whatsoever to maintain our ability to test nuclear weapons should the need arise. Especially in the House, there was a move to cut money for nuclear modernization. So they applied some cuts to the long-range standoff weapon. They applied some cuts to the ground-based strategic defense, which is the replacement for the Minuteman III. There's some policy issues that are going to be in play this year. There's some would favor letting the authorization for the use of military force, which went into effect in 2001, to expire. There are some challenges to the Trump administration's policy on service by individuals who are transgender. There are still some bad feelings about the Trump administration's decision to transfer money to the border wall, and so the House has proposed to cut the ability of the Pentagon to transfer money between accounts. But by and large, a lot of consensus, a lot of things they're not arguing about. They're not arguing this year about the size of the military, really about the naval modernization, the Army. There's really no issues in the Marine Corps. Most people are agreeing with General Berger's move to modernize the Corps, and so I'm heartened by the amount of agreement there is. Representative Adam Smith, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, had an interview last week, and it was pretty candid, I thought. He talked about that there's going to be a fight within the Democrat Party, especially between the progressive wing and the more moderates, about cutting the defense budget. The progressives, he said, like to use the number 20%. Within the Republican Party, there's also some skepticism about national defense, and I would attribute that to the Libertarian Party. They have programs and projects that they call, we advocate for a more restrained foreign policy or a more responsible statecraft, something that would, they call for the end of the forever wars. And I would, my position would be that the forever wars ended years ago. And I mean, we only have some 5,000 or 6,000 in Afghanistan now, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 in Iraq, and just hundreds in Syria. And they're certainly not war fighting. They're there to help the indigenous forces more or less, except for some counterterrorism missions. So I would suggest that forever wars have probably ended some time ago. There are some big issues looming. Yeah, good. Let me just close up here. There's some issues to be grappled with. The size and the shape of the Navy. The Navy is struggling, and the Pentagon, to define what they think it should be, much less what the America thinks it should be. There's going to be continuing need to struggle for support to maintain the nuclear triad. And as we go forward, the defense top line will be a subject of a lot of discussion. We've talked about flat budget top lines. When you have a flat budget top line, because of the influence of inflation, what you're actually doing is losing about 2 to 3% of buying power every year. And so you can say flat budgets, and that sounds good, but every year, because inflation inexorably goes up, you're losing buying power. So I'll end there. I'll say that I'm encouraged that there's some things we no longer argue about, and that is, how do we perceive China? I think it's pretty much universal now in America that China represents a threat. I think people now acknowledge the importance of space as a domain. That was kind of a controversial subject 18 months ago. And I'd also say cyber falls in that same category. So there's great bipartisan support on China, space, and cyber that America needs to do more and play in those domains. So I'll end there, John. Thanks.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'd just like to start out by asking you about your thoughts about how China's nuclear capability increased. They're working on building out their own triad of submarines, bombers, and ICBM, land-based ICBMs. How does that play into debate and discussion of American nuclear modernization and the updating of our own triad?
You want to start, Tom, or do you want me to?
I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, I mean, so for as long as I can remember, China has maintained somewhat of a minimal nuclear arsenal. So they had some 200 nuclear warheads uploaded on ICBMs, and that was essentially it. And they had made it plain to the world that they did not intend to have a first strike capability. Nobody really does, but that was their posture. And now they have changed that very deliberately, and they are now talking about moving to, they have SSBNs, they have ICBMs, and they're also building a brand new bomber. And so there has been a change in China policy. And because the United States has to deter both China and Russia simultaneously, that you could say, well, how? Why would that change in China affect the United States? Well, because we have to maintain the ability to deter both those countries. It does impact our nuclear modernization policy, and also makes it very it makes an argument very difficult that some would wage that, hey, why does the United States spend all this money on our nuclear arsenal? Nobody else keeps it up, whereas the Chinese are actually actively modernizing their arsenal with new warheads and new delivery systems.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things to Tom's great comments there. First of all, we have to keep a very close eye on what China's doing. Tom's right. They've always claimed this is just for defensive purposes, and it's no first use and all that sort of thing. And it is growing. I don't sense a Chinese ambition to grow a gigantic nuclear force, but I think they feel obviously that they need a more modern one and a slightly larger one. But this really complicates things when you start to talk about getting into arms talks with the Russians. I call it the three-body problem. There's an interesting science fiction novel written, ironically, by a Chinese guy or gal, I can't remember, called The Three-Body Problem, that talks about essentially, two bodies orbiting around each other. The differential equations for solving that are really not that hard. But if you get three bodies revolving around each other, they're almost impossible to solve. And trying to imagine just getting three parties to the table, much less having a successful negotiation over nuclear weapons, is almost impossible. So that goes again also with the fact that the Russians are actually modernizing their own deterrent. Their deterrent came due for modernization, and they are modernizing it, just like ours has come due. And because we've kicked the can down the road on all three legs in varying degrees, they've all now come due at the same time, which is very expensive. But that speaks to that number one national security interest that I set the stage for earlier, and that is survival of the nation. We have to make sure that we have that thing correctly configured. And I think when I was the J5, was participating in the New START treaty negotiations, and we came to the conclusion, totally in concert with Stratcom, that we could actually get by with a decent number fewer nuclear weapons. But it made no sense whatsoever to do that unilaterally. You don't want to trade away your trade space, and Vladimir Putin is not like Gorbachev. He's going to pocket anything you give him. So it's essential that we modernize this thing while we also try to get to the table and have some kind of responsible negotiations with our potential adversaries that results in a useful, verifiable weapons control treaty. And to try to do that with three parties is going to be extremely interesting and difficult.
What is your view about the happening that's been going on the Hill about the Columbia ballistic missile subs, the new ICBMs, and the B-21 Raider program? Relative to this, I mean, can the changes in terms of Chinese and Russian capabilities be used to say to the Hill, hey, here's something that we got to deal with? And you're talking about budget constraints. How do all these things come in and play together?
Well, of course, the service's first response is, hey, this is a national capability. It shouldn't come out of my budget. You have to plus me up to do this. And the Navy was the first service to say, hey, we shouldn't have to pay for the Columbia. It's going to make a huge dent in our shipbuilding budget. And of course, the Air Force, kind of picked up on that idea and came back with the same thing. Guys, we kicked this can down the road longer than we should have, and it's come home to roost. And additional means are not going to be there, and we're just going to have to step up to the plate and take care of our number one national security interest. It has to be done. And that's part of the usefulness of looking at this in a prioritized way, is there may be some other capabilities that we have to trim a little bit in terms of supporting allies and partners. I think I give the president good marks for putting pressure on our allies to spend more on defense, although I don't care for the style that he uses to do it at all. I think it was important that we get this done, but it's a zero-sum game, and we're going to have to pay for this and get it done on time and with good quality.
I mean, the unfortunate reality is we have delayed all these programs so that now the major bills for all three of these, the ICBM, the bomber, and the submarine, are all coming due at the same time. It's probably, and the perfect storm is like 2025, when these will all be in, hopefully in procurement phase. And that is at the same time where people are saying, well, the budgets are going to be flat. These, like Admiral Winfield says, we have a mismatch in our strategy. The means do not match our ends, and people are kind of turning their heads away from this big problem that's going to happen. But the country, the Pentagon cannot conduct this nuclear modernization with a flat budget from what they have today. It's not going to work, and they can't cut enough soldiers. They can't cut enough other legacy things that, they call the KC-135, the refuelers that we're depending on today is legacy. And yeah, they are legacy, but they're what we have today to refuel our aircraft. And so you can't cut your way out of legacy aircraft to pay for some of these big programs. And so that something's going to have to give if we want to continue to have a nuclear deterrent in this country. And, there's been people have asked the question, do we need a triad? Can we make do with a dyad? Can we, do away maybe with the ICBMs? Every time that topic comes up, I know it came up when General Mattis first took over in the Pentagon, and he looked at it hard because I don't think he was even actually convinced that we needed all three legs. And he came back from that assessment convinced that America needed to continue to rely on a nuclear triad.
And I'd rather trim our deterrent because of a successful negotiation with Russia and or China than to do it because of budget pressure. And the other thing, just to put a closing note on that, is we can't forget the fourth leg of the triad, which I know is a non sequitur, but that is the command and control capability, which is really, really tiring. It's potentially vulnerable in a new age of cyber attacks and the like. Really desperately needs to be upgraded, and that's not going to be a cheap bill either.
And started thinking about China and Russia's expansion into space-based weapons, and also looking at anti-ballistic missile capabilities in the face of Chinese and Russian hypersonic capabilities. How do we fit all these things in, and where should the U.S. military's priorities be, at least in space?
Well, I'll start. I think they made a great step forward with the start of the Space Force. That was controversial a year ago. Now you won't hear a word of dissent about a Space Force. So organizing is, the first step. When you have a big problem, you need an organization that's designed to tackle it. And I think we're pretty close there. I mean, again, hypersonics today, hypersonic missiles owned by both Russia and China really do not have a realistic defense right now in the United States. And I think we're years from even having such a defense. And so in the short term, the United States response has been to match Russia and Chinese hypersonic missiles with our own hypersonic missiles in order to deter their use or to at least have a counter. And that might be the best we're able to do. I think we will never build a ton of hypersonic missiles. They're too exquisite, probably too costly, but I think we need to have some while we think about this topic of how do you defend against a hypersonic missile.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think the one area of hypersonics where we may be able to build more, and we find that we actually build a lot, is the air-breathing versions. But Tom's right. The intercontinental, sort of boost glide types, we don't need a lot of those things, frankly. But we're going to have to ramp that production up. Again, back to the hierarchy. We have to make sure we can defend the United States, right? And we've long stated that we're not going to try to build a ballistic missile defense against Russia. They just have too much. It's too sophisticated, too many penetration aids and the like. But it makes a lot of sense to be able to defend ourselves from a rogue threat, either a North Korean threat or an Iranian threat, or some kind of one-off accidental, wacky thing coming from Russia or China or something like that. And for that reason, we really ought to be continuing to build a ballistic missile defense system. It's an interesting. When Jim Miller and I were working closely together, we built this curve. And on the x-axis was time, and on the y-axis was capability. And there were two lines on the curve. One was North Korea, intelligence assessed North Korean capability in terms of how many missiles they could essentially launch at the United States and how that might grow over time. And then a companion curve was what was our ability to defend against that. And it's not a nice linear curve because things happen. You put more missiles on the ground, more interceptors in the ground, that curve jumps up. Interestingly, if you improve the capability of those interceptors, the curve jumps up. It's what I call quality having a quantity all of its own, because now you don't have to launch so many at an individual missile coming at you, and you now can take on more. But that curve was never a very happy curve. So we're going to have to be, if we're going to be serious about this, we're going to have to get more innovative than we have been. In addition to kinetic solutions, we're going to have to look more to directed energy. Probably not lasers unless you can get those with size, weight, and power up into space. It's just, clouds and the like are not friendly to lasers, and we can't get enough power out of those things right now. But there are high-powered microwave capabilities that are at extremely high power that are being developed that might be useful as a real force multiplier in that regard. So we just have to keep pushing on this. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that the country is very, very vulnerable to a cruise missile attack. Whether it's launched from Russian aircraft or Russian submarines or the like, again, back to that hierarchy of interests. There's a lot more we should be doing in that area than we are. And this gets to sort of, what are the sexy communities inside the services? They're not things like defending the United States against cruise missiles. They're building, brigade combat teams and aircraft carriers. Teddy Roosevelt had a great saying that, Americans learn from catastrophe, not, experience. It's going to take some courageous leadership, I think, to step up and make some of these sort of difficult changes in the services. And to a final point on your question about space, I totally agree with Tom on the Space Force. It came out, it was ridiculed. There was a great TV show about it, which I actually enjoyed watching. But the fact of the matter is, I look at Space Force the same way I looked at the Ballistic Missile Defense Agency, right? If we didn't break that thing off as a separate entity, the service, the Army in particular, would never have funded it the way it needed to be funded. It was just a sort of a poor bastard stepchild, and breaking it out as its own entity got it the funding and the attention that it needed. And I think the same thing was happening in space. And let's press on and make it work.
Well, Admiral, what comes to mind with your talking about a cruise missile attack is, what is your thought about the funding of the Block 5 Virginia-class attack subs, and building out, submarine deterrence, and some of the things that I've been reading about autonomous, warships and so forth as part of the strategy to build out the fleet?
Yeah, here's man bites dog. Naval aviator says future of Navy is underwater. It's just really, really perilous to be on the surface of the ocean right now. We really haven't experienced that catastrophe, in Teddy Roosevelt's words. We haven't really felt what it's like to be targeted by a sea-skimming, supersonic, weaving cruise missile that has its own electronic countermeasures. We just haven't had to do that, and it's a terribly lethal threat. And when you consider you might have to do that at the same time you're trying to go after a ballistic missile that's coming after your ship, it's just a really difficult place to be, whether you're in a manned ship or an unmanned ship. So I'm not saying we need to just do away with ships on the surface of the ocean. There's a lot of good work for those things to do, but we really do need to start thinking more about undersea warfare. And so to that end, the Virginia payload module is certainly something that we're going to need to fully fund, and to give it the right kind of capability, to include a downward capability so that we can do what we call seabed warfare. I'm a huge believer in offensive mine warfare. When you look at the current state of the art of the U.S. offensive sea mine warfare capability, it is appalling. It is grotesque in its lack of sophistication. When you think about how you can take some of the technology capability this country has, Silicon Valley, some of the primes, whatever, we could build an amazing undersea capability in that regard that would really present a dilemma to some of our adversaries. But it's just not one of those sexy things. This is a Navy problem. The other services have plenty of similar problems.
Let me pile on that, John, for just a second, just to second that. I mean, in the world of competitive advantages, areas where the United States has a clear advantage over our adversaries, undersea warfare remains perhaps the best advantage that the United States has. And so when the Pentagon delivered their 2021 budget and they had cut a Virginia-class submarine, so they were just going to build one, even though they had the capability to build two, it's just astounding to me. If you're looking at what do we need to counter China and you cut a Virginia-class submarine out of your shipbuilding program, I don't know how you make sense of that, honestly.
And of course, the reasons for that, as we all know very well, were political. And we've got to do a better job of briefing Congress, whatever it takes, in order to get our priorities in the right places there. It also speaks to, the question of how big should the Navy be. And there's a lot of studies going around. Hudson Institute just released a study and that sort of thing. But it really irritates me when I see a ship number come out. 355 ships is the number, because like any metric in business, it can really drive you to bad behavior. Especially if it becomes a politicized metric. You're either for 355 ships or you're an idiot, or something like that. And when you look back in history, I never forget CNO Vern Clark, when he was in office, he said, talking about trying to keep a fleet like that ready. Okay, it was like, we have understated the requirement and we have underfunded the understated requirement. It takes a lot of money to man and maintain 200 ships, much less 355. So we just have to be very careful not to overshoot and to think strategically about what should this Navy look like, not give me a number and we got to do stupid things to achieve that number now because it's been politicized.
One of the things that comes to mind is from the recent DoD report on China is the integration of cyber warfare capabilities into conventional, bombs, missiles, and so forth warfare. How should the United States military be confronting the issue of cyber warfare and countering China stealing our secrets? Like a year ago, former National Security Advisor John Bolton slammed the Chinese for stealing the plans for the F-35. I mean, what do you see in terms of building up our abilities in the cyber space?
Well, in the world of espionage, shame on you if the other guy steals the plans to your F-35. I have a hard time pointing a nasty finger at China and saying, stop, or I'll say stop again, about espionage. We do the same thing to, who knows? Of course, they probably get the better end of that deal because our stuff is better than their stuff. It's really more a question of two things. Doing a better job of defending ourselves from either exfiltration of intellectual property, which is what we're talking about, industrial espionage, and it's not just in the defense space, it's everywhere. And also defending ourselves against malicious attacks that are designed to take down, either infrastructure or military networks or what have you. That's on the defensive side. And of course, we got to make sure that we are developing our offensive capability, obviously protecting that offensive capability, but making sure people know we have it. And this gets into a very similar argument to the nuclear argument. Many of your listeners will understand the difference between counter force and counter value. And counter value would be going after their military offensively in a cyber capability. There's an ethical and moral question there. Do you go after their civilian population with a cyber attack if it comes down to that? And I'm one of the people who thinks that we should probably have that capability, but forswear using it unless it's used on us. And that's sort of a no first use policy in terms of targeting somebody's infrastructure. But if they're going to come after our infrastructure, then fair game. So those are the areas that good cyber defense and then the right kind of cyber offense is what we ought to be thinking about, rather than pointing fingers at the Chinese for doing what every spy does in every country.
Yeah, this is something, a danger, a threat that the Pentagon was very slow to recognize. They are just now coming on board with a way to require contractors that support the DoD to have some basic level of cyber standards. So they call it the cybersecurity maturation model, CMMC, which is a set of standards which progress higher and require contractors to protect the information for which they've been provided. It is just now starting, and so we're not going to be able to protect the plans for the F-35 or the Ford-class carrier, but maybe the thing that comes after the F-35 or comes after the Ford-class carrier, maybe we'll be able to protect those items from Chinese espionage. I mean, the good thing about the F-35 is even though they've got the plans all the way down to each rivet, they still don't have the capability to manufacture an F-35 like we can make it with the engines and all the other components. And so we still have this competitive manufacturing advantage, but that won't last forever.
And Tom is exactly right. One of the things to consider on this CMMC is that a lot of it depends on a once a year report where you self-assess and you tell DoD, yep, we've reached the proper level for this type of a program and we're good to go. And that's a good start, but we really need to start working hard, and there is some capability out there to do more continuous monitoring. It's sort of like the clearance process, right? Rather than getting your SBI once every 5 years, now they're going to start continuously monitoring, key metrics about your behavior to see if there's an alarm bell that ought to go off. We need to do the same thing in cyber, because once a year doesn't cut it.
What sort of capabilities do you think the United States should be looking at on the offensive side that you're able to talk about?
In terms of cyber or just in general?
So in terms of cyber and the offense, and in terms of being able to deter them, I mean, I talked with another friend of mine's, former admiral and carrier commander, and he sort of like joked that we could be getting into a battle with the Chinese Navy, and all of a sudden they hack in and shut everything down. So what should we be doing in the offense?
John, I think this goes to my statement earlier that a strategic military concept has an expiration date, and you can continue to throw resources after it, but you're asymptotically going to approach irrelevance or inability. And the Chinese haven't been sitting around for 20 years while we've been doing counterinsurgency operations. They have been studying us very closely. They've been either stealing our stuff or building their own stuff or buying stuff, and they really are. They're not quite as where we are in capability or capacity, as Tom points out, but they're really close. And we always counted on our technical superiority to be able to overcome the tyranny of distance and the tyranny of initiative. They were going to start this thing, and we were going to be a really long way away when it started. That advantage has eroded to the point where there's lots of war games being played in the Pentagon by the ONA and those guys that show that, hey, we would have a very hard time preventing them from doing what they would want to do. So let's look, rather than pouring more stuff into the problem, let's think of a new way of approaching the problem. And I would like to see us look at a concept that really does target what the Chinese fear. And what the Chinese fear the most is control of their own population. And one of the ways you get at that is through cyber. They have pretty good firewalls and the like, but we've got some pretty doggone good cyber warriors out there who can get through those things. And if you demonstrate to the Chinese that you can actually influence their ability to control their own population, that may well be a nice piece of the deterrence equation that prevents them in the first place from doing things that don't align with our interests. So I would like to see that. Sort of what's the purpose of the cyber, rather than let's just go make tools that can take down people's networks. How do you do information operations against the Chinese population, similar to what the Chinese and the Russians and others are doing against our own?
I'd agree. The only thing that really comes to mind is, we talk a lot in military circles about the great advantage that the Chinese have in ballistic missiles, both ground launched and cruise, and that has a cyber chain that we can get inside of, and so we don't have to, knock down every missile they shoot at us with an SM-3 or an SM-6. We could actually get inside that kill chain to some degree, because they rely on cyber to get those missiles on targets, especially at aircraft carriers that are 2,000 kilometers away. Admiral, we might have lost John.
John's back.
All right, I'm here.
You missed Tom's great answer.
All of a sudden, I saw everything go like still, and I was like, okay. So, I mean, one of the things that I've been reading a lot about is moving into like autonomous vehicles. There was an article in Defense News, I think it was yesterday, talking about robotic armored personnel carriers and things of that sort, and the other robotics in the Navy. how do you see that playing out in terms of U.S. war planning in the next decade or two? I mean, are we going to see the Terminator?
Let me start this, and I'll just speak to the domain that I'm most familiar with, and that's ground. And I think to some degree, it's the domains of air and sea are a bit easier for autonomous vehicles because you don't all of a sudden run into a ditch that you weren't expecting. Maybe you do if you're underwater. But unmanned vehicles, autonomous vehicles in the ground dimension are really, really hard. I mean, we have a hard time having trucks that go over interstate highways. And so if you have a vehicle that's going off-road through broken terrain, wadis and valleys and streams and things like that, and you're expecting it to not only not get stuck, but also engage an enemy, that's a really hard military task. And then you also have to maintain essentially connectivity with these autonomous platforms, even when they go in, into a city and they go around a concrete building. This is no small task. And so where I think there's going to be utility in autonomous vehicles in the ground environment, it's not going to be, I don't think, as fast nor as transformational as it has been in the air and maybe the sea domains. We'll see.
Yeah, a really interesting question. This is all about artificial intelligence. Some people say artificial intelligence and machine learning, which kind of gets my hackles up because machine learning is only a subset of artificial intelligence. Expert systems is really the other subset. But there's a bright future, I think, in our systems for that. But we are in the midst of what you call an artificial intelligence spring. And normally what comes after an artificial intelligence spring is a fall and a winter because people overhype the technology and we learned that it's not as capable as we thought it was. So where are we going to go with this? First of all, there are two elements that I'd want to talk about. One is the technical capability and the other is the ethics associated with this. And there's a lot of attention being paid to this. The Pentagon has a terrific office, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Command, I guess, or whatever, the JAIC, and all of the services and the primes are working very hard to explore where artificial intelligence belongs and where it doesn't belong inside our weapon systems. And you can visualize a hybrid system that would use both an expert system, which is sort of just Boolean algebra if-then statements, normal computer program, but very sophisticated, and machine learning, which can sense and detect and classify things that no human is capable of doing. Whether it's Google pictures or whether it's X-rays or whatever, machine learning has shown that it has some real capability in this area. So visualize a weapon system, a loitering weapon system, let's say over enemy territory, that is using machine learning to find and classify and identify targets, but using its expert system to go ahead and decide how it's going to go about and whether it's going to go about attacking those systems. Same thing applies to the mines that I talked about. You can imagine a very sophisticated acoustic processing capability using machine learning that's able to actually discriminate target types. But then an expert system that really kind of does the thinking and maybe even links with other mines and that sort of things. And actually, I just wrote a piece of fiction on that is pending with the Naval Institute. It's kind of fun to write. On the ethical side, we have to be very careful with this. We're nowhere near having a Terminator. We're, Skynet or whatever it is, but we do have to be very, very careful with the ethics to make sure that a human was involved in at some level in the lethal decision making of an autonomous vehicle or semi-autonomous vehicle. It's a good idea to be able to try to have a human able to abort that weapon system before it actually makes a final lethal decision. It's good to be able to have a confidence level and its ability to identify something. And you find confidence levels associated with, for example, Google's ability to identify your face in a bunch of pictures. And you want to be able to surpass a level so you get there. So those are very important issues we need to explore. But autonomy is going to be a part of what we do in the future. And it's more difficult in some places. I agree with Tom, it's terribly hard in the land domain. But the air and sea domains, there's a lot of potential there.
Either we're going to go to questions.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for a cue. Yeah, we have plenty. Let's start out with some directly election-related questions here. So our defense has never been the skill and funding of our military, but the will of the president to use them effectively. We've seen how Trump knows how to do that. Which country do you expect to test Biden if he becomes president?
Which country? What?
Yeah, I think I think the country that's least likely to, I really believe, and is probably a country that has nuclear weapons, because you don't want to, or the country that we would be least likely to confront in an arena like that would be a country that has nuclear weapons. So we're not going to push too hard on North Korea, for example, I don't think, under a Biden or a Trump administration. In terms of Iran, though, and Iran is feeling the effects of not having developed a nuclear weapon. I think they wish they had at some point, because they are potentially vulnerable. And Iran's been fairly quiet, even though there are a lot of militia attacks in Baghdad that are getting us angry, and we're talking about coming out of the embassy and all that kind of stuff. I think that at least until the election is over, you're not going to see an awful lot coming out of Iran, because they don't want to be what the president uses as an external distraction if he's not doing well leading up to the election. After the election's over, who knows what's going to happen there. But one thing is that we've learned is that generally the first country to challenge us after an election has been North Korea. And there's a very simple reason for that. We always have a really big exercise in the February-March timeframe in Korea that irritates the North Koreans, and they always act out with some sort of ballistic missile launches or what have you to express their displeasure. It's going to be interesting to see what happens this year, because we have, as part of President Trump's engagement with Kim Jong-un, sort of throttled back on those exercises. So that irritant may not be as prominent this winter as it has been in winters past.
Has the style of our president, referred to by the Admiral, affected our working military relationships with our traditional allies, particularly our European allies?
I'll make some comments in that some of them have never been better. I mean, we've had continued high investment in the European deterrence initiative in Europe, which has led to investments in the Baltic states, other places that have really kind of increased our warfighting capability. Our relationship with the Israeli Defense Forces has really never been better as a result of the great relationship we have right now with Israel. And so there are some points of stress, with burden sharing and things like that, particularly in relation with Tokyo and Seoul. Those tensions, I think, have not really affected the mill-to-mill relationship that we have. But I'd defer to Admiral Winnefeld if he has any thoughts too.
Yeah, I agree. The military to military relationships are generally not going to be affected by something like that unless it's really gross. It's the political relationships that matter, and there is a growing distrust, frankly, of the United States politically that it's going to be hard to recover from. But in terms of military to military relations, I don't see that being problematic right now.
Through innovation and technology, can we not reduce defense budget and still modernize?
There's always that promise. Tom, you go ahead.
Yeah. Here's the dilemma. If we were the only ones using innovation and technology, yes, we could use our innovation and technology and gain an advantage on our adversaries, and maybe we wouldn't need as large a fleet or as big an army or an air force. But the Chinese, the Russians, and others are furiously trying to innovate and use technology as well. And so maybe their programs aren't as sophisticated as ours, but they are working to catch up. I mean, the Chinese increased their defense budget by 6.2% this year. The United States essentially held its budget flat. And so if trajectories like that continue, you can't rely on the best gadgets, because after a while everybody will have them. And one of the results of having this, the United States military relies more and more on commercial items, is things like sophisticated night vision equipment is available to whoever has money now. It's not a sole provision of the United States military.
Yeah, and I would say, new technology to do what is the question. And I really want to get back to this, the ways part of the ends, ways, means environment discussion. I sort of look at this through three horizons of innovation, right? And I didn't invent this. The first horizon is sort of incremental technical improvements to your the systems that are in your current concept. And we're really good at that. I mean, there's nobody on the planet that's as good as that. The second horizon of innovation is sort of out of the box changes to your current military, but the current military concept remains the same, but you do these step function improvements. And we're also very good at that. Just look at stealth technology and some of the other things that this nation has produced that are incredibly capable. It's the third horizon of innovation that we have a hard time getting to, because concept innovation is much harder than technical innovation, and that's rethinking the whole idea. And so if we were going to change anything, I mean, I wouldn't be saying, well, let's buy more technology to chase the current concept. The current concept isn't going to last much longer. I would say, let's go find out what that new concept is. And I would argue there's a new one we need in Europe, and there's a new one we need in the Pacific, and they're out there and they're available. And then let's look at what it takes technologically, both in terms of capability, which means modernization, capacity, which means how much of the stuff do we need, and then readiness, how ready do we need to keep it? Let's look at that. And it wouldn't surprise me if we actually could spend a little bit less if we found the right new concepts. I'm not ready to commit to that yet because I got to see what they are. But it's not because of technology on its own. It's because we found a new way to solve the problem. And then there was technology that enabled that.
This will have to be our last question. Given Russia and China's history of ignoring treaty requirements, how confident are you that treaties are worth signing, ever worth signing?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, there has to be something in it for both sides. And maybe there was something in it for both sides, for example, in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. Maybe that started out and there were advantages, but as time went on, the Russians perceived there was no benefits to them to stay in that treaty, and they left. And so we have to look for those arms control agreements and treaties that provide security for the United States and give the other side some reason to be in it. And if we can't find that construct, we ought not to sign treaties for just the purpose of signing treaties.
Yeah, I completely agree. No side ever gets exactly what it wants in a treaty negotiation, nor should it, because you wouldn't have to have it in the first place. And so when you look at the New START treaty, neither Russia nor the U.S. got everything that we wanted out of that treaty. It was a hard negotiation. I think Rose Gottmuller and her team did a very good job of pushing on that with good support from the rear. And we got a decent treaty out of it that gave us verification measures that we needed. Not as many verification measures as we wanted. The Russians were testy about that, but it much better than nothing. Same thing could be said for the JCPOA with Iran. Was it a perfect treaty? No, it definitely was not. But it gave us a lot of insight into the Iranian nuclear program that was live, daily, and I think one of the things that people lost sight of in throwing the thing out the window, yes, there was a time horizon, but there's nothing to say that as you approach that time horizon to say, okay, the horizon's approaching, we need to extend this thing or we're going to put those sanctions right back in place, rather than just jettisoning the whole treaty and losing all the verification measures that we had in place at the time. So yeah, a bad treaty is not something you want, but if carefully negotiated, treaties certainly serve a very useful purpose, but you'll never get everything you want.
Thank you. All right, John, I'll hand it back to you for conclusion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Admiral, and thank you, Tom. It's been a very enlightening roundabout. We've covered a lot of issues from nuclear modernization to cyber to naval modernization to dealing with the strategy that we need moving forward in the current battle space. And I thank you very much for your time. And this has been a very enlightening experience for me, and I'm sure for the viewers at home.
Well, thank you, John. I think, one point I would make, and I'd be interested in Tom's point of view on this as well, is we have a window of opportunity after this election, regardless of who wins. It's kind of like everybody can take a deep breath And if the Pentagon can be articulate and thoughtful in what it presents to the Congress in terms of we've got to think of some new ideas here for how we're going to approach these problems, not just the same old stuff that produces things and bases in congressional districts, but a new way of approaching these problems. We've got that window of opportunity before partisan politics takes over again to try to get something done. Pentagon's going to have to be thoughtful. It's going to take a lot of courageous out-of-the-box thinking and leadership, and Congress is going to have to be willing to bite the bullet a little bit on some of the things that they love. But if we don't do this, we really are at risk at 4 or 5 years down the line of waking up one day and realizing that we no longer have the place in the world defending those prioritized interests that I talked about the way we really ought to as a nation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for the first year of the Trump administration, I would say there was a huge degree of candor coming out about what the nation needs and what our current state of readiness was. I remember all those hearings where General Mattis talked about how shocked he was and how we were so short on some of these critical precision munitions. And then as the administration aged, the guardrails came up, the gutters went into the bowling alleys, and all of a sudden you couldn't talk about those kinds of things anymore. And it became, inappropriate and to talk about those. And I'm hoping we have a similar outbreak of candor, whatever happens in the next election for the next administration. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.